Welcome to Stoughton Spotlight. I'm your host, Jeffrey Pickette. We're continuing our Conversations with the Candidates series, and on this episode, I'm joined by one of the candidates for the Redevelopment Authority, Michael Barrett. Michael Barrett, the incumbent, is seeking a second full 5-year term on the Redevelopment Authority on the upcoming election here in Stoughton on Tuesday, April 9th. So, Michael, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Jeff, and thank you for all you do for the town. This is, I know, a busy time of year for you guys.
Well, thank you. And I know that this, oftentimes the town elections, it focuses on the Board of Selectmen and the school committee, and some of the other races kind of get treated as an afterthought, but the Redevelopment Authority does a lot in the town, so I thought it was important to be able to bring both you and your opponent in to be able to discuss exactly what your visions are for the Redevelopment Authority if elected to a 5-year term, and what the Redevelopment Authority does. There might be some residents who aren't too familiar with the board, so I think that's a good place to start. Is you've been on the Redevelopment Authority now for 6 years.
Yes.
How do you define the role of the Redevelopment Authority?
Great question, Jeff, because there is a lot of confusion, and I'll get into some of that, of the things that we learned during the 5-6 year term, the 6 years that I've been on the authority. The Redevelopment Authority is really a tool that was enabled by state legislation to give cities and towns an ability to really move through the development process and put together plans outside the day-to-day running of the town, outside the day-to-day politics of the town. It's state legislation, Mass General Law 121B, and it outlines all kinds of things. We have 5 members. 4 are elected by the people in Stoughton. 1 is appointed by the state, the governor, I guess, but the Department of Housing and Community Development. So our role is to work with the town to identify areas that may need redevelopment, and for years we all know that the center of our town is a prime spot for it. We viewed it as coming out of the master plan effort that was in place in 2011 through 2015 or so, and they identified a lot of work in the downtown center, and the Redevelopment Authority then stepped in to work with the Planning Board, to work with the Board of Selectmen and Town Manager. We hired some consultants, we put together a plan, we updated a lot of things, and really it's all about putting together a plan that will enable the town to move forward and accomplish something that just may not work within the town on a day-to-day basis. There are certain powers granted to work with developers, to the SRA under the guise of an approved development plan to work with developers. We can go out and issue bonds, we can buy property, we can sell property, we can lease out stuff, we can do a lot of things for the town and make the development happen.
So you mentioned the purchasing of property. Where does the Redevelopment Authority get its funding from, as opposed to the many town departments? It's through the budget, but you're not a line item in the budget. You're not funded through the town's budget.
We're not funded through the town. We're actually a state agency working closely with the town. The SRA has its own investment fund, which is really left over from prior investments. The SRA was originally formed in 1963, approved by a vote of town meeting. Worked on the North Industrial Stoughton Park, and at that point they had a lot of property. They sold off property, worked with the developers, got all that done. So at the end of the day, there was a piece of property left over, which is the former landfill, and we have a lease there with Tunnel Hill Partners. They run the C&D facility, and they pay us rent. So on an annual basis, we're collecting rent from Tunnel Hill for that property. We do still have some leftover funds that were sitting in a savings account when I first joined the SRA, and we weren't earning a whole lot of interest on it. And so what we did is, I gathered the troops and we put together an investment policy. We went an RFP out to the market. We brought in 3 firms, and we ended up partnering with Bartholomew and Company, who also does a lot of work for the town and many other municipalities across the state. And so they oversee that investment fund for us, keep us at the right level of risk, and they've done a good job. We've been able to keep it making a reasonable amount of money without putting the money at risk, because it is public funds.
Watching many of your meetings, looking at the couple of candidates forums that were held this election season, the downtown is certainly a priority for the Redevelopment Authority. other boards as well. So let's go through some of the parcels in the downtown that seem to be brought up. We'll start with the train station. That's been brought up, year after year after year. Really started gaining steam, I'd say, in about 2011, 2012, and the town has been close several times, according to headlines in the paper, to purchasing the building, but it's never quite come through. So tell me about this kind of saga of the Stoughton train station and how you see it fitting in the redevelopment's role, Redevelopment Authority's role, and also just in the bigger picture of revitalizing the center of Stoughton.
No, it's a great property, and interestingly enough, the train depot, the train station, was really my introduction to the Redevelopment Authority. My wife had previously been the recording secretary working on the board prior to my getting involved. And when the board found out about her husband's background working in finance and working in real estate development for a very large retail company and just a lot of good relevant experience, they asked her if I would come in and talk to them. And in my first introduction to the board, I came in and they told me they had been asked by the Board of Selectmen at the time to put together a deal to convert the railroad station, to buy it, and then develop it into a restaurant. We had an interested party. And I walked in and I asked them, what's your plan? And they talked about these plans that were built 10, 20, 30 years ago for the downtown. I said, but what's your plan for this property? And it sort of became clear they didn't have one. They had some great ideas and they wanted to do some things. So ended up 6 months later, there was an opening on the board. All 4 remaining members called me up and said, Michael, can you apply for this position? And the Board of Selectmen appointed me, and that term lasted about a year, and then I ran for election 5 years ago and was voted in at the time. No opponent. That you mentioned there's an interest. Yeah, it's the first time in my recollection that we've had more than one candidate running for office, and I think that's great. I think all of our offices deserve the diversity of opinion and more people involved. It shouldn't be the same small group of people, A, getting to decide everything, but A, bearing the burden, because a lot of these roles require a lot of work. So anyway, we worked with and had a restaurateur who was interested in developing. The gentleman in question had at the time, he owned a diner in Wanatown. He had another restaurant in a former MBTA property, and he was working on a third one. He was hoping to move in and sign a lease with us for the depot. We weren't going to buy it until we had the lease in place, just for financial reasons. We couldn't afford to buy it without a lease in place. And he ran into some financial difficulties on the restaurant he was building at the time. He did get it open, and I believe he's been successful. Actually, I haven't been to it in a long time, but at that point, some of his financial backers backed away from the deal. So the Redevelopment Authority then went to the Board of Selectmen and said, listen, we've tried, we put out an RFP, we've talked to as many people as we can at this point. We can't afford to just buy it and sit on it and do nothing with it. We can't afford to buy it and then fix it up, so we really need to put this back in your hands. MBTA has been, I think, a difficult partner to work with. A lot of times they had very unreasonable requests, and so it has been back and forth, and I'm glad to see that the Board of Selectmen is finally. We've stayed in touch. We have not been, the SRA has not been involved with that. Going forward, I would love to see the SRA work with the town to either redevelop the property. I mean, I've heard stories over the years. Personally, I'm a big fan of craft beer, and one of the stories was that maybe a craft brew pub type of thing would open up, and it would be, given the beauty of the building, given the uniqueness of its little environment, it would be a perfect place. It's an expensive place. I mean, I understand the economics of the beer industry. I think most small craft brewers would have a hard time affording it, but maybe working together with the town, adding it to the things we have downtown. In and of itself, if it's the only thing downtown, it's not going to survive. But you combine that with the House of Brews and maybe some of the other projects if we ever get them off the board and get them moving. And I think we can have a vibrant, livable, walkable, workable downtown in Stoughton.
So there is a philosophy, kind of, I would say a difference in philosophies of how to go about revitalizing the downtown. And one seems to be the thought of let the private development do it.
Yeah.
Kind of a hands-off approach. The other is to actively acquire the major pieces of property in the downtown and spur growth through government intervention, more or less. So where do you kind of fall on that scale of the philosophy of how to go about doing this?
I'm a little too impatient to wait for the private development to come along, particularly in the environment we have. But on the other hand, I know that I don't have, the SRA doesn't have, and the town doesn't have unlimited funds to just start buying a property and creating the development on their own. My belief is by working together and creating an environment where we can encourage private development in. Private developers will come in if they believe things will happen. If they don't believe the job's going to get done, if they think it's going to take 5 or 10 years, they're not going to be that interested. There's plenty of other opportunities for them to go out and invest their money. My background working at a large retail company is, a lot of times we put up some money. We didn't fund a lot of our projects. We borrowed money. We got investors to put in the money. We created those private, if you will, partnerships. It's just a little naive given the current environment, given the history of what has happened. I mean, we've been waiting for private people to come in and develop the downtown for a lot of years, and on their own it's just not going to happen. We need to create an environment that makes it worthwhile for them to come in. If that means buying a piece of property or funding some of the due diligence type work, which we've been doing. We've funded a number of studies for the town, parking studies, due diligence on the Randolph Savings Bank property, just other things we've done working with Pam McCarthy since she came in as economic developer. We've given the money to try to keep moving forward one step at a time. So it's a balance of the two.
Right.
It can't be all at either end.
So let's go just big picture. Let's look back at the last 5 years. Let's look ahead at the next 5. What would you say yours and the Stoughton Redevelopment Authority's biggest accomplishment is over the past 5 years, and what do you want to do over the next 5? What would you say would be the biggest priority, in terms of whether it's, it's acquiring a certain building, or, what kind of want you to look back and look ahead?
Okay, looking back, I think the Redevelopment Authority has established a lot of internal and administrative type policies. My opponent actually brought it up at one of the debates that shortly after I joined and became chairman of the SRA, which I did for 4 years, we updated our charter just to reflect what we were doing today. The old charter reflected the original North Stoughton Industrial Park, and it's like, well, that's been done for years. That's not what we're doing. That's not what the board's asked us to do. So we went back through it and cleaned up all those policies. We put in the investment policy. We created some operating type policies, cleaned up a lot of old files in the office, got rid of the stuff that we no longer needed, because as new people come in, they now have a place they can go and they can look through stuff. We have an operating procedure book that someone can just pick up and start reading, and tying together a lot of those loose ends. The single biggest accomplishment was working when we went out and spent a significant amount of money of the SRA funds to develop a plan. And we didn't bring it all the way to completion, because one of the things we learned, and it was great experience working with the consultants. They come in and say, wow, you got a lot of people in this town who really love the town and really want to see something happen. And they said, but you got a lot of people who only want to do it their way and only want to do their idea. And what we needed to do was find a way to bring those two things together and get people to realize that your idea and my idea aren't that far apart. And if we could come to a consensus and do stuff. So the redevelopment plan turned into as much of a planning outline and an information booklet that we put right up online. We created a lot of transparency in the SRA. I think of all the boards, at least the ones I had looked at, Selectmen, Planning Board, our minutes were always the most up to date. I think a lot of the boards have now caught up because the Selectmen made it a priority a couple of years ago. We did as much as we could online on the town's website. We created a Facebook page to get the word out, and it's not the most active of pages, but at least we used it to try, particularly during that time frame, to communicate with people and get their input. The plan itself, we had the Harriman Group. It was originally the Cecil Group. They changed their name. They come in. We held several public forums. We got a lot of people. 3 huge volumes of work, one of which was focused strictly on education, so that anyone in town, we learned at the forums, people would come in and ask questions, and people would come in and make statements that were like, you don't really understand. You're saying what you've heard, that's not how it works. So we made this an educational type booklet for people. The next big piece of that was the outline for the town. The only thing we really were missing was consensus on a particular project to serve as the cornerstone of the plan going forward. I personally didn't believe, and it wasn't a full agreement with the board, but it's not the SRA's plan, it's the town's plan. The SRA picking a project and trying to run with it, we were going to run into all the same noise, all the same divisiveness that occurs that's the SRA's plan, it's not the town's plan. What I was trying to do was get to the Board of Selectmen and other boards and say, listen, let us work together. Pick one of the projects. We evaluated 5 or 6 different things around the center, that any one of which could become, coming out of the master plan, the whole post office site, the fire station, what we're going to do with it, and there's a lot going on there as well. But we need to sort of pick one and work together and move towards it as a town plan. When that happens, I think we go back and we take a little dust off, because it's now been a couple of years old, and that plan can then get updated and submitted to DHCD and become the plan that the town will use to truly accomplish something in the downtown.
Well, what's your priority of the properties that, of the projects, potential projects, what's your priority?
I don't have a specific priority, to be honest. I would love to do the railroad station and develop something in there. I think the State Theater is another great possible project. I think that's a longer term because it's so much more, and it's gonna take a lot of money.
Is it realistic in terms of how much money, for the town to be getting involved in it? I mean, we're talking millions.
With the State Theater?
Yeah.
I have the same concerns as every other taxpayer in Stoughton. It is a very expensive project. If we don't all agree it's the right thing to do, then it's probably impossible. However, if we don't do something and we lose it, we'll never get it back. So town has to make a hard decision on that. I think from an SRA perspective, we would be far more inclined to go with a smaller project, which is why we were interested when the town wanted to do something with the Randolph Savings Bank. But same question as the train did. What's the plan, folks? Because without a plan, the SRA really can't do much. And it doesn't make sense to buy a property so that someday you might be able to do something. You really need to focus and have a plan. That one brought some additional parking, could serve, and there's so many different uses, and the town hasn't really focused on a particular single use for it, and I understand it may even be now going back on the market and selling it, but there's a potential relocation for the post office, which would open up that whole square, which would be, again, something in between the train depot as a singular site that could be developed into something in the State Theater, which is a massive project, would be the whole post office site, what we could do with it. We had worked with the town. We'd met a couple times with the post office to talk about it. And post office, I think, was getting annoyed with the town of Stoughton that every couple of years you come and say you want us to move, but you don't have a plan for us to move. You really don't. You just want us to move, and we're not going to move until there's a plan in place, and we need X, Y, and Z, and come back to us when you're really serious. And again, I think we've made some progress as a town doing that. In fact, I think we just funded some work to do a plan for that property for the town. So I guess if I had to pick, it'd probably be either the train depot or the post office site as ones that are doable, realistic projects. There's still some controversy as to what you would do with either one, but I think they're both critical projects, ideally located to spur development. If we had unlimited funds, I'd go all in on the State Theater, but we don't have that, and it's not fair to burden the taxpayers with that. So there was some discussion the CPA funds could be used to acquire it, and that might be okay, but still leaves a lot of money to be had. And we need more evidence and more proof that that can happen before we tie up that money. But at least if you acquired it with CPA funds, you would still own it. And if you bought it at a reasonable market price, you could still eventually decide what you want to do with it. So a little bit less risky than just giving money over from the CPA to the State Theater Group.
So it sounds like, listening to the past answer, that you don't want the SRA people to see it as just the SRA's decision, and you want to be working with other town groups. That has and hasn't happened over the past several years. It kind of ebbs and flows. So how do you make sure that going forward that the SRA is working well and collaboratively with, I'll just say, the Board of Selectmen, the Community Preservation Committee, the Planning Board, to name a few boards that all have interests in also developing the downtown?
Yeah, I mean, that has been a tough battle. I think when at the time we finished the plan with the Harriman Group and brought it to the Board of Selectmen, and we made a presentation, and we gave them the 3 volumes of work, and we sat in front of the board in a televised meeting and talked about what each of the plans were, and it pretty much went nowhere, and then the town went on a different path, and the Board of Selectmen was a little bit engaged in other things for the next couple of years. The new board came in, they asked us to come back, we went back, we represented with some little updated information, but primarily the same information because the plan itself hadn't changed. Since that time, we've had more frequent contact. We've worked very closely with Pam McCarthy. The current chair of the SRA has been working with the Board of Selectmen and meeting with them. We've had a few joint meetings with them, and so I think the hard work of those years trying to build that relationship and get on the same page is beginning to pay off, but there's more to be done. CPC, I think, is another great committee that I've been on for 6 years. Again, I was on that actually before the SRA. My appointment to the CPC today is tied to my role on the SRA because there was a charter change a couple of years ago that allowed the SRA to appoint a person. And so I've served as treasurer on that committee, and I think working with those folks helps to foster that relationship. Planning Board Chairman Joe Scardino is also on the CPC with me, so we've tried, and I know some of the SRA members have worked with Joe in the past on the Master Plan Committee. And I mean, basically, we just need to work hard working together and learn to trust each other and work towards the same goals. It's not an easy task, or it would have been done a long time ago.
Want to address, of course, over the course of a campaign, there's shots fired on, across the bow on both sides. The most recent penny saver, your opponent, Mark Zamanian, questions your attendance at SRA meetings.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It kind of came out, and he alluded to it a little bit at the end. And my current work schedule does take me out of town a lot. I'm not here 7 days a week. I believe I have missed a total of 2 or 3 SRA meetings in the last 6 years. So to suggest that I haven't attended is not even close to the truth, and a very unfair statement that is unfortunately, I think, a reflection of some of the divisive type of backroom political maneuverings that go on in this town that aren't productive. I'm very proud of the record I've had with the SRA. A couple of those meetings I've attended via teleconference, which is, again, that was another one of the policies when the state come out and allowed you to have public meetings over with remote participation. We developed a policy, we put it in writing, we put it in the policy book, but generally I prefer to be there. We've been able to schedule those meetings in times. And the meetings I missed, I was on a family vacation and the meeting got rescheduled by a week and I was out of state. And I know there was 1 or 2 others that just, things happen. We all have lives. We have busy lives. But my record of attendance is better than most, I think, if you go across town boards.
So we are wrapping up, coming near the end of the show. So I'd like to give the candidates an opportunity to make a pitch to the voters. Election day is April 9th, and you're running against another opponent, 2 candidates for 1 seat on the Redevelopment Authority. What makes you the best choice to continue serving on the Redevelopment Authority? Well,
again, I think 2 things. One of the things I said at the debates, I've lived in town for 34 years, which in and of itself doesn't make you the great candidate, but I'm fairly new to this whole political scene. 6 years on both the SRA and the CPC. I consider myself a newcomer. I'm learning more about the people and places every day, but my educational background, I have a master's degree in finance. My work experience working for a couple of large multinational corporations, pretty much focused on finance, budgeting, planning. I've had experience with change management, with organizational design, all the things that come into place as we think about the type of projects that it will take and the type of organizations we have to build and work together. So I think on qualifications and experience, I think I stand out well above my opponent. It's been 6 years. It's been an honor to be there. It's been exciting. I almost wish I had gotten involved many years earlier, just in various aspects of the town, because it's a great learning experience. Met some great people. It's a lot of work, a lot of time and effort at times, sometimes more than others. I think I have tried to be as open and honest. I pride my own reputation for honesty and integrity. Transparency, I mentioned the whole thing with the minutes and the Facebook page, and just an insistence that we had everything online as quickly as reasonably possible. I mean, minutes come out of a meeting, they need to be approved, and then a few days later but we kept up on that. Every meeting we approved the last meeting. Transparency, my opponent has spoken volumes about transparency, and yet in both debates and in his ads, he hasn't once mentioned his own efforts to get $1 million of CPC funds from the town, from the taxpayers, for a project in his neighborhood. Not necessarily a bad project. In fact, on the CPC, we did vote to support it. A little concern about the price. It's a very expensive project. He talks also about the timing and the fact that the plan isn't, the SRA plan hasn't been implemented. Well, the SRA plan can't be implemented until we get more work from the town, more cooperation from the Board of Selectmen, Planning Board, and others, as well as DHCD. If his group had come to the town 2 years earlier, the $1 million would have been $400,000. I mean, things change. I mean, I big proponent of open space. We've done a number of projects on it, but little troubled by the fact that he claims to be transparent but doesn't talk about it. I mean, that's not necessarily very transparent in my book. So I think, again, the qualification, the education, the experience, I think I've proven to be a good working partner with. Gotten along with several different boards of selectmen over the years now. Obviously, they've all changed in nature. Some of the members are the same, but there's a lot of new people there. I've been able to get along with the members of the Planning Board and the CPC and just created a good, healthy working environment, created a little bit more trust amongst them. And I think that makes me a good candidate. So I'm asking the residents of Stoughton. I'm as concerned about the financials. I understand the financials. I'm asking for your votes going forward, and I appreciate your time and effort if you've watched through this whole interview.
So we've run out of time on this episode. I want to thank Michael Barrett for joining me today, and I want to remind you to vote on Election Day, Tuesday, April 9th. The polls will be open from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. Michael is the incumbent for the Redevelopment Authority. He's one of 2 candidates running for a single seat on the Redevelopment Authority. So once again, thank you for tuning in. I want to thank CJ Mullen for directing, and we'll see you next time on Stoughton Spotlight.